That's a hard act to follow. I'm glad to be here. I can see a few familiar faces from 2 years ago where we went in search for the soul with Carl Jung. So I don't know if you found it since, but I'm here today to talk about something in a slightly different topic. I'm going to look at the issue of human intimacy and how the world that we're living in militates against it. Simon Harris recently provided what I think was a wonderful aspiration. He was talking about Ireland, and he said he wanted Ireland to become the best country in the world in which to raise your children. And I thought, wow, that is some aspiration, isn't it? And I thought afterwards, and if it became the best country for you to raise your children in, it would also become a great country for us to be adults in. So this is wonderful aspiration. But the question is, how do you do it? Sometimes the aspiration is great, but the actualization of the answer is something else. And I'm of the view that there are social trends at work in our society today that are militating against that. And what I'm hoping to do today is just give you a brief run through the historical basis for that, for those changes that are happening in our society and in our culture. And they're happening at a very subtle level because they're inside in the institutions, inside in our education, and sometimes they creep up and we don't really see them for what they are, which is that they're a form of ideology. And I will talk about this as a pernicious ideology, which can be identified as what's called the postmodern condition. But before doing that, I want to just look at what is the issue. When we talk about intimacy, what am I talking about? Some people may have thought, we'll be talking about sex. Well, we're not going to be doing that. That's way too early on a Thursday morning to do that. But intimacy, I'm taking Erik Erikson's, the developmental psychologist's understanding of an incredibly important part of our human development in becoming mature adults and living in the world, which is that we move from our adolescence and late adolescence, where we form our identity from all the formative influences, and we create a sense of self and identity as we venture into our early adulthood. And the key piece of that next stage of life is the development of intimacy, the capacity for intimacy. And what he means by this is, he said, it's the capacity to commit oneself to deep connections and partnerships, and to develop the ethical strength to abide by such commitments, even though they may call for significant sacrifices and compromises. The avoidance of such experiences because of a fear of ego loss may lead to a deep sense of isolation and consequent self-absorption. So I'm going to look at the way these social effects are actually impacting on people's ability to make these kind of bonds. Because the main challenge at that period of time is to be able to create these meaningful connections, not just with a partner, but with friendships, with family, and with the wider community. So you become a citizen. Hannah Arendt talks a lot about the incredible importance for a society is for people to have a sense of identification with their society and become citizens of that society. I'm going to look at the influences that are actually causing problems with that. So in order to do that, I want to talk about the postmodern condition, and I want to introduce you to what that means. The postmodern condition is a term coined by French philosopher François Lyotard, and is the result of an intellectual movement that developed in France in the 60s and 70s and became embedded in the universities in the 80s and 90s, especially in the United States. It is now firmly established in many of our own institutions, and it has spread into a wider society by way of the graduates from those institutions beginning to work in media, in journalism, in law, in education, in the civil service, in social welfare services. They're bringing with them certain ideological understandings of how our society should be, and that's affecting how people are being affected in their psychology. These ideologies are the primary influences that underlie what are now termed the culture wars. Gender, trouble, identity politics, and what's rather pejoratively called wokeism. I will argue that these influences have a profound damaging effect on young people in early adulthood, often leaving them unable to establish the personal development required to live rich and fulfilling lives of which a strong personal relationships are an essential part. So, what does postmodernism do? It's a reactive philosophy. It's defined by a reaction to and a degrading of what we call Western civilization. That's the underlying theme, is to take what we now recognize as Western civilization and dismantle it. I'm going to describe how that happens. And I'm going to describe not only how it's been happening and the effect it has psychologically on people, but I'm also going to look at what would we need to change. What do you and I need to understand to become part of our society that will somehow influence and move away from this, to reestablish the kind of values and the kind of ideas that have led to the greatest development in humankind, which is called the Enlightenment. Western civilization, of which we are the product. This is us here. You look at the capacity of what we have. You say, how did that happen? That's not accidental. That took 5,000 years. 3 main tributaries came in to develop what we call Western civilization. Right back from the ancient Egyptians, the Judaic tradition, then into the ancient Greeks. The Greeks who invented democracy, who learned who developed philosophy, mathematics, astronomy. These extraordinary rich seam of human knowledge that the Greeks produced. Then on into ancient Rome, the Roman engineering, Roman currency, Roman trade. All of these things came together. And by the 4th or 5th century, they were all embraced by Christianity. See, when we think about Christianity, sometimes we think Christianity is the overarching or the umbrella of Western civilization. And that is true. But it does so because it has already taken all these other influences. So this is extraordinary. When you look at the history over that 5,000 years of what we call Western civilization, we can see that through all kinds of chaos and difficulty and pain and the troubles and the Black Death and slavery and all that there's this gradual continual movement, a movement towards development, towards sophistication, towards learning, towards becoming human beings that are so extraordinary in our capacity to learn. That didn't happen by accident. That all happened over a long period of time, and Christianity became the overarching narrative for that. So when the postmodern philosophers started to think about this, they recognized that Christianity was the great, we'll say, organizing system that was helping this progress. And Ireland played an important part in that, because during the Dark Ages, those who are from Kerry will know that Skellig Michael, most people say, oh, that's for Star Wars. Well, actually, that's not just for Star Wars. It's famous for Star Wars. It's actually more famous for actually rescuing Christianity for the Western world. And it is from Skellig Michael and the island of Iona that Christianity spread all over Europe and became a huge institution. Now, I'm not saying for one second it didn't have problems, because it's a story which all kinds of interesting things, as you look at church history, will say so many things are wrong, but you also have to look at what is right, what it worked. And one of the things it gave rise to the Enlightenment. So when you look at the Enlightenment, you think, what is the Enlightenment? And you realize that this was the moment in time when the full effect of progress developed, and 4 principles. We developed 4 principles. Truth. There are truths that are independent of human mind, and thus absolute and universal. There's knowledge. We can learn things. There's objective knowledge, and we can know some of them. Reason. The human faculty to learn and how to apply our minds to develop problems, solutions to our problems, and progress. How do we progress in the world? So this period of enlightenment then gave us the Age of Reason. And the Age of Reason, we can look at the rise of science, the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the self, and the demystification of the world. So these 4 major pillars. The invention of medicine, disease prevention, innovation, people lived longer, fewer people died in childbirth. All that was going on during that is all product of the Age of Reason, based on the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment has all its roots down in the Christian tradition. So, what happened though? The demystification of the world. As reason developed, something very strange happened. The human being began, and the human leaders began to get very proud of what they were able to do. Up until then, reason was always working under the umbrella of God's will and faith. But with the development of reason, people began to think, do you know what? Maybe God is not that important anymore. So what happened was that everything that was mystical could be explained in other terms. It could be explained in terms of materialistic, mechanistic world. And as a result of that, the need for God as part of our system started to ebb away. And the person who noticed this more than anybody and understood the full implications of what this was going to do. Now you might be saying, what's this got to do with postmodernism? This has everything to do with postmodernism, because this is where the postmodern movement came from. Friedrich Nietzsche famously, and last time we were here, we looked at the great parable, the parable of the madman, where he describes what's actually going to happen with what he called the death of God. And he says, and I'll go through this briefly, have you not heard of the madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around him just then, he provoked much laughter. So here Nietzsche is capturing the cynicism, because humankind had taken over the job of knowledge and of running the world. We now could be proud we no longer needed God. So they were laughing. And they're teasing him, saying, are we hiding? Has he gone on a voyage? And they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. He says, where is God? He cried. I will tell you, we have killed him. You and I, all of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Now, this is a very interesting line. When we unchained this earth from its sun. When we unchained knowledge, when we unchained morality, when we unchained all the things that we need in order to progress from its sun, which was the belief in God. He says, where are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Now, Nietzsche is saying this is 100 and something years ago. But when you think of the world we're in today, this description is so much, it seems so familiar that when we look at the world, our modern world, our great world with all its technology, with all its amazing development and progress, this description, where are we going? Swinging, straying through an infinite nothing. Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? The darkness is coming. This is what he's saying. Do we not need light to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the gravediggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing yet of the divine decomposition? God's too decompose. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. So what Nietzsche is telling us here is, when he says, do we not hear the gravediggers who are burying God? And of course we don't. When he was talking about this, he was predicting what was going to happen. And he says, how shall we comfort ourselves, the murderer of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all of the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderer of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. And who will wipe this blood off? This is very dramatic, of course. Now here he comes and he says something really important. He says, what water is there for us to cleanse ourselves? What festivals of atonement and what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? And then the second thing he says, must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Okay, I won't go, I'm a bit tight for time, so I'm not going to go through the full thing. So, what Nietzsche is saying, what are the sacred games? So the postmodernists call these the overarching narrative. The Catholic Church gave the fundamental narrative for how we'd run the world, how we'd organize ourselves. It provides the basis for knowledge, for truth, for all of these things. And then it was gone. And so Nietzsche says, what new sacred games will we use? Well, the three new sacred games that happened in the 20th century in order to replace, as a result of the death of God, which was the overarching narrative, was secular versions of it, because human beings do not do without an explanation. Human beings need to be part of something greater than themselves. So when you take away all that went with the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches and Christianity generally from Western culture, you leave a secular space. You open up a vacuum where people need something to make sense of their lives. And the three big meta-narratives that took the place as a result of the death of God were fascism, communism, and neoliberalism. And fascism, when you look at this as the Nuremberg Rally, if you look at that and you think, do a little thought experiment and think about what would it be like to be there. This was extraordinary. You think about the sense of meaning, the sense of the enormity of it. And Albert Speer, of course, was a genius, as well as Goebbels, the two great geniuses around. Albert Speer was able to actually organize this form of production with all its ritual and all its flags and music and everything else. And then as the evening wore down, he got the columns of light reaching up into infinity. And you, there, listening to the songs and becoming part of this mass, you know, I have no idea you're walking gently towards the end of the precipice. The most evil, horrendous happening of the 20th century. Questionable, because the second one is just as bad, communism. So these new narratives, neoliberalism, which became the letting loose capitalism in its worst form, which is that actually not regulating it, not seeing that capitalism, when it's tied into Darwinism, which is the survival of the fittest, would lead you into a situation where a model which would actually disenfranchise so many people and cause great poverty. Communism, the great utopian dream. We don't need God. Marxism was that, religion is the opium of the people. So now we have a situation coming into the 20th century, throughout the 20th century, when these grand narratives, these great explanations, that's the modern era, don't work. So what happened? A group of people, intellectuals, began to say what we need to do is we need to get rid of the big story, the grand narrative, the meta-narrative. These are problematic. Religion is problematic. Communism doesn't work. Nazism don't. Now, the Frankfurt School, which are the beginning of the roots of the postmodern world, they were all Marxists. Sometimes you'll hear in academia people say, well, I'm looking at this through the Marxist lens. It's kind of a nice phrase, isn't it? And I think, you need to remember that the Marxist lens is a bit opaque because it's covered in blood. So when we think about what these guys were doing, they were saying, the problem is that we need to dismantle. We dismantled the big pictures because they're all grounded in exploitation. Because Marx, of course, talked about the exploitation of the ordinary person. Everything comes down to exploitation from a Marxist point of view. So therefore, these guys were looking at all of the systems, particularly Western capitalism and particularly American culture, and saying, we need to dismantle this. And they developed a system called critical theory. The French, of course, not to be beaten by the Germans, decided that they were going to get in on the act, and they began to dismantle the Enlightenment. And this was the birth. And they began to do this by using the phrase deconstruction. So deconstruction, it's a nice word. And the idea, and when I think about deconstruction, I think about the Notre Dame Cathedral, Paris, one of my favorite places, and looking at the devastation. But I was there recently, I was looking at the work they're doing to put it back together again. Amazing. They are deconstructing it. They take down a brick and they put a number on the brick. And they say, right, because we want to put this back together. However, postmodern thinking were telling us that they were actually going to deconstruct, but they didn't. And here's the areas that they wanted to deconstruct: truth, knowledge, religion, history, science, literature, art, and personhood. So the postmodern condition takes these. I'm just going to find my notes here. So, with regard to truth, and here's the picture of, this is the deconstruction model of postmodernism. This is what you're left with. Truth. There are no overarching truth. Everything is a matter of perspective. This also has a Nietzschean influence. Perspective. It's what your perspective is. There is no truth. All you're left with is perspective. And that means that you become your own truth. Knowledge. Knowledge is produced by people in power. This is Foucault. In other words, when we look at knowledge, what the postmodernists were doing is they're saying, you know, the things that we are produced to us as knowledge is actually ideologically driven. Where knowledge is not there to help us to understand reality. Knowledge is simply being produced by those in power to keep us either enslaved in some way or form. But the basis of knowledge and reason, that's not how we go at stuff. And this comes from Marx again. The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of the ruling class. So we're producing knowledge. It doesn't have any value beyond its production to keep the system running and to keep those in power. Religion. We're all familiar with Dawkins and Hitchens and Dennett and Harris. They're the more modern versions of the dismantling of religion, taking it apart, applying a rationalistic basis for it, and leaving people then without any ground for their faith. History. Michel Foucault is the main sinner when it comes to history. His view is that history, he calls these epistemes, are just stories, that history is written by the people in power. So when we look at history, we're not looking for what actually happened. We go back and look at history simply to find out what power game was going on. So knowledge and power become very much connected to each other. Science. We take science out of the picture because science is seen as an ideology that it's called scientism. And again, we look at this from the point of view that, again, those in power are simply using, there's no objectivity in it. So when you look at what this does to our belief in science and progress, we can see the results of that. Literature. What's the difference between these two? Pride and Prejudice and 50 Shades of Grey. So you think literature is no longer examined from the point of view of the beauty of the writing and the story and the connection of the human imagination to the character. That's always what good literature was. But no, when the postmodern people get a look at literature, what are they doing when they're reading it? They're trying to figure out, was Jane Austen a victim of the patriarchy? And everything you look at in literature becomes a formula for actually finding out how this awful thing called the Enlightenment and civilization was corrupting people and twisting their minds. And so you lose the connection to literature. Art. Okay. What is art? So you think about art and you think about, okay, here's an example of postmodern art here. Because aesthetics and beauty and because the Renaissance and because of all of the wonders of that time, that was all just a bit old hat. And it was all, again, representation of those in power. So we'll take that away and we'll say, right, what is art? Art is actually self-expression. So there's no standard. You don't need a standard to have art. So here's a picture of an installation consisting of, this is Tracy Emin's own unmade dirty bed with used condoms and blood-stained underwear, and it can be yours for an estimated price of between 800,000 and 1.2 million pounds. It's currently part of the Charles Saatchi collection, and he has said the price for the sale, which has been offered through Christie's, is far too low. So any of you that have a few bob to spare, you can have this for €1 million. This is the urinal. Duchamp, a French artist, was asked to provide a piece for the Tate Modern in New York. And he sent a urinal. because he was just literally taking the piss. And they loved it. And it is now and it's a famous piece of modern art. So you think, okay, so what am I saying about postmodernism? I'm saying that when you start to pull these things apart, and in the universities, all the different, the academics, they loved it. I mean, the French were kind of rock stars. I can see these four guys, Michel Foucault and Derrida, and I've got this kind of thought experiment of them actually sitting at the left bank with their Gauloises, and saying, oh, my friends, mon ami, which part of the Enlightenment will we now deconstruct this morning? And they pick something else that gave the foundation to our civilization and say, we'll have a go at that and see what happens. This has had an enormous effect on our society. But it's done very subtly because it's not a political movement. These guys are not coming out of the universities, which they did in 1968. In 1968, they nearly burned Paris to the ground. This is much more subtle. This is you get into the institutions and you dismantle the things that give people meaning. You dismantle the things that actually give hope and truth and something to live for. And this is what Nietzsche is saying. My time has not yet come, he says, and he goes back to the madman. He says, he looks at them and he says, this tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It is still recounted how on the same day the madman forced his way into several churches and started singing his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Led out and called to account, he is said always to have replied nothing but, what then are these churches now, if not the tombs and sepulchres of God? But he said his time had not yet come because Nietzsche didn't understand. He understood his time had not yet come, but it has come. It's here today. What does it do? What are the outcomes of this? The first is cultural and moral relativism. In other words, we don't have any grounding for truth, so any truth and any culture is equally valuable. So we see something that is part of a culture and we say, well, it's part of their culture. So we must respect that, rather than actually, if it is part of the country, is there another way of evaluating its value? Its value is not that it belongs to a culture. Its value has to be grounded on something else. Here's an example of a feminist, postmodern feminist, who says that she thinks that the hijab is a garment of liberation. Now you think about that. When I heard this, I was reminded of George Orwell's quip. He said, and I'm kind of paraphrasing him here. He said, some ideas are so stupid that only an intellectual could believe them. Cultural and moral relativism, identity politics. When your personhood and the dismantling or deconstructing personhood, we went through literature, I forgot about personhood. The self is a social construction. This means there's a denial of anything called an innate temperament, any possibility that some kids will come into the world with more intellectual prowess, quicker to learn. No biological based gender, no. We have to level everything up, an inborn natural talent. So the human being is a social construction. The self is a mirage. Yourself is a mirage. And it's been constructed by your society. And that's all that you have. So when you do that, so you're essentially you're leveling. Kierkegaard talks about the great leveling human beings to be all like cogs, simple cogs in a big machine. You and I have nothing unique about us. And as a result of that, we drift towards identity politics, because where do you get your identity if you don't have a personal identity? You get it by affiliating with the group. Now, this is a return to tribalism. The Enlightenment and the movement towards the Enlightenment and development moved away from tribalism, which was the primitive way of life. And we began to see ourselves as a society, as a culture, not just a tribe. But if you take away selfhood, you have nothing left except your identity, and your identity is with the particular group that you're in. You develop a victim orientation because you have all of these things. the notion of power and knowledge, what's happening is you're told consistently that you have been oppressed. You are a victim of the power-hungry social structures that are at work. And you must undo that. You must dismantle that. Burn it all down so that out of the ashes, they didn't find out what's going to come out of the ashes. We're not sure yet, but it doesn't look good. Rampant subjectivity. You're left just with yourself swinging, and Nietzsche talks about the swinging of the world, and people are left swinging. Younger people trying to find a base for their identity are left with just the subjectivity of how am I feeling today. Intellectual erosion. Again, it's not too good. You cannot measure people by the fact that some people, the notion that you could say that some people are a bit more intelligent than others, it's again one of the cardinal sins. So this is what the outcome of the postmodern condition. An anti-white prejudice, because you see, you are all heretics. You're all terrible sinners because you're white. Most of the people here, I don't see anybody. You're all products of this civilization, of Western civilization, of the Enlightenment. And you better start feeling guilty about that. Because do you not know that you've been collaborating with all the persecution and horrible things that's ever got in the world? And if you're still a believer, you need to go to confession and confess your sins for being who you are today in this world. So what happens as a result of that, then there's a prejudice against being white. There's an anti-white movement going on. And finally, there's an alienation and an atomization. Okay, so the psychological damage. I got 10 minutes. What does this do to a human being who's growing up on these influences when they go in at 17 or 18 into university, and it's already started in the secondary schools anyway? The first thing is they develop narcissism. Now we know narcissism is on the rise. Nearly everybody says, oh, I know a narcissist now. Back in the day, nobody knew what a narcissist was. But anyway. But narcissism is a normal part of development, and Freud understood this. And anybody who's been in a supermarket recently and watched a 3-year-old having a tantrum will see what's happening. But sometimes you don't understand what it is, because there's this incredible crisis going on inside the child. Because narcissism is the natural place to be as a child up to about 2.5, 3 years of age. It's the notion that a child has as they're cognitively developing, they're in the world, they cry, and somebody comes along and comforts them. They get hungry, get a tummy ache, somebody feeds them. They wet their pants, somebody changes them and puts talc on them and smells them, tells them they're gorgeous, and even their products are gorgeous. It's lovely, So when you have all that going on, you develop this connection to reality, which tells you that you are the most important person in the world. And not only that, but you're incredibly powerful, because when you say something or not say something, when you react, the world changes for you. You are in charge of the world. And when you see the child having a breakdown in a supermarket because they've been told they can't have a crunchy, what's happening is there's a realization happening, which is the world doesn't revolve around me. Oh my God, now that's terrifying, because now you're powerless. So this is a huge psychological development in a human being. And that's why they rant and rave and they go crazy, because they're trying to get it back. If I scream louder, the world will listen again. It's just the world forgot that I was really important and that it exists for me. So if I scream and shout and everything else, maybe, but then it doesn't. And gradually over time, the child learns to have a different relationship with reality, and they're able to compromise, and they're able to recognize, and they're able to wait. They're able to wait for things. So narcissism is that. Now, some people never grow out of that. We know some people like that. We all know that. But this philosophy is actually encouraging people to stay in that zone, which is it's all about them. Hedonism, which is about pleasure. Oh yeah, and the other thing with narcissism is therapy is very bad for narcissists, because it tends to convince them that they're right. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the therapy world, which is trying to cope now with narcissism, because when you take a broken human being who is insecure and frightened, therapy is really good, because it helps them to reparent themselves and begin to love themselves and being cared about themselves a bit better. But if you get a narcissist, you're actually, you're throwing apples into the orchard, it really. Hedonism is the commitment to creating pleasure by experience because there's no other value. And this leads to a consistent refinement of sensuality and gratification. Crass materialism and pornography, and a very useful film, American Psycho. It's a tough film, but it's brilliant from the point of view of what triggers the guy into the psychotic state, because he sees the business card of his competitor, and it's beautifully done because the business card is better than his one. So crass materialism is part of what's encouraged in this model. Pornography. There are currently 200 million subscribers to the adult platform OnlyFans, which is an adult platform. There's 3.2 million content creators. So you pay your $12 a month to watch all kinds of sex and genitality and whatever, but there's 3.2 million people, mainly women, who are earning money from displaying their genitals on OnlyFans. This tells us something. Sense of entitlement. I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to just breezily go through those. Pessimism, superficiality, ressentiment, which is again a Nietzschean word, and hopelessness. I'm not saying that the young people who are in this world are actually all, because they're reacting to this, they're beginning to push back a bit. What I'm saying is the way that we are developing, the influences that have gone on in our world for the last 20 to 30 years are producing this form of psychological damage. So what we need in response to this is we need a new meta-narrative. We need a new narrative. And we need to look back and think what worked. I'm not talking about, we talked last time about the soul and Carl Jung and going back to the creed. I'm not saying that we need to revisit the creed and go back in time. I'm saying we need to look again at the content of the world that the Christian world gave us, in terms of giving a philosophical ground on which to help influence how our society is developing. The first of these is transcendence. And this is the need we have, that human beings need to have, to be part of something greater than themselves. That connections to the spiritual world, however you define that. But the thing that's more important here is that in that issue of transcendence, the areas where you look at in terms of transcendence that have brought people great richness are exactly the things that are being pulled apart by a postmodern thinking. The notion of beauty, for example. We think about music and beauty and our attraction to that. So when we look at literature now, we get away from this thing of saying, well, was Jane Austen really influenced by the patriarchy? And stop and have somebody read the paragraph and feel the words and think about Darcy and think about what's going on and what's that lovely nuance of those relationships. Or Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, which is off the menu now in the American universities because it uses the N-word. So you can't read Twain. To Kill a Mockingbird is off because of it. All of these amazingly rich stories which give people transcendence, because transcendence is being able to get out of yourself to your imagination. We need to look at the values that will help us to do that. Truth. You shall know the truth and the truth will set you free is a Christian phrase. We don't have to be too literal. We don't have to tie it in there, but we can take the truth of that and say, no, there is such a thing as truth. Reality exists. It's not a construction. That's a postmodernist idea that all reality, you heard it yourself, you create your own reality. Well, actually, you don't. And somebody needs to stop and say, no, you create your beliefs about reality. You choose to look at certain things and not other things. That's a choice. And as a result of that, you'll have a perception of reality. And the other thing you'll hear is, well, this is my truth. You've your truth and I've my truth. And I'd say, no. You're not that brilliant. You don't. You have an opinion, and sometimes it's crap. Unthought out, incoherent. And you've never bothered your head to stay long enough to think it through. So, well, sometimes you have to be tough, The sanctity and uniqueness of the individual. This is a tenet that comes out of Christianity. The sanctity, and in the postmodern condition of the self, no, you're not. Every human being is unique in both their essence and their existence. Their essence, there is an essence, and their existence. So that's Viktor Frankl, but I think he captures that thing. Human evil is real. And I'm going to quote Solzhenitsyn here because I think it's one of the best descriptions of the Christian understanding of human evil. Because if we don't accept that there's something incredibly destructive about the world, we're looking at all these fancy-pantsy academics who are creating all this, and we never think about, do they actually take any moral responsibility for what this is doing to people? No, they don't. It never even entered their mind. It never even registered on any moral piece that there's a morality in what you teach young people about how they live, what life is about. The line separating good and evil passes not through states or between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts inside us. It oscillates with the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an uprooted small corner of evil. That's the bad news, guys. You all have a bit of it. I have come to understand the truth of all religions of the world. They struggle with the evil inside a human being, inside every human being. It is impossible to expel evil from the world in its entirety, but it's possible to constrict it within each person. Freedom and personal responsibility. Man becomes truly human only at the moment of decision. In the Christian world, we are going to be called to account. Whether you believe that that's going to be happening in the next life or not, that's not the point. The point is you're accountable. You are responsible in part for who you become. You have freedom and personal responsibility. You are not simply a product, a social construction of a power dynamic that just wants to use you up. Forgiveness. One of the great Christian traditions is one of forgiveness. In the postmodern world, there's no forgiveness. If you become a heretic and you say something about gender, about race, about work, about intelligence, about migration, about any of these things that doesn't suit a particular ideology, you will not be forgiven, you will be punished. And we need to find a way to look at forgiveness. Hannah Arendt says, without being forgiven, released from the consequences of what we have done, our capacity to act would, as it were, be confined to one single deed from which we would never recover. We would remain the victims of its consequences forever, not unlike the sorcerer's apprentice who lacked the formula to break from the past, to break the spell. And then self-examination is again, when you look at the scriptural verse there that says, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. What does that mean? That means you become self-aware. You reflect on what you are doing. You reflect on what you have to do for yourself before you start guaranteeing it for other people. And of course, go back to Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. So the challenge we're left with comes, I'm going to quote Jung here. This is the challenge that we need to constantly look and put before young people. What kind of a person do you want to become? And with those tenets in place as a pedagogy, in a replacement for what I call the poisonous pedagogy, which is a quote from Alice Miller, poisonous pedagogy of postmodernism. So we can say with Carl Jung, are we to understand the imitation of Christ in the sense that we should copy his life, and if I may use the expression, ape his stigmata, or in the deeper sense that we are to live our own proper lives as truly as he lived his in all its implications? It's no easy matter to live a life that is modelled on Christ's, but it is unspeakably harder to live one's own life as truly as Christ lives his. So I'm going to finish on this. All the above can be understood as forming a guide towards becoming the kind of person who will bring something worthwhile into the lives of those we touch. It is a form of self-actualization worthy of the title. Our educators need to reverse course from a pedagogy that weakens, stifles, and deadens the human spirit. We owe that much to the next generation, and its result on a societal level is to create the best country in which to raise our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that excellent start to this morning's proceedings. And I'm sure we could all have listened to Michael even for considerably longer, because it was an extremely interesting presentation. And as per with all our speakers, we're going to allow a couple of minutes if anybody has any questions or observations to put to Michael. This gentleman here.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
just wondering where the leadership for all this change is going to come from. I don't see any sign of it on the horizon.
Well, this is a conundrum. I don't think I'm alone in this. The latter part of this, I've been looking at this issue of revisioning Christianity and actually looking at, you know, we need people to, and I suppose to some extent I'd say, well, the leadership, where does the leadership come from? It comes partly from us. Our conversations with people, our conversations with young people, or our grandchildren or our children or whatever, and they bring and educating ourselves a bit more. Now I'm gonna just put a little thing in my new book here. It's down there. But educating yourself around ideology and being able to answer questions, because an awful lot of younger people, when they're getting this, there's nobody contradicting. They can't stand up in a sociology lecture and say, "Sorry, professor, I don't agree with you there. I don't think truth is just relative." You know, because or whatever is going on, there's a consensus of opinion out there that and people are afraid. So yes, there's a problem. Now I think that there is a bit of work being done, and I think we can do our bit, which is to educate ourselves about it and have conversations and challenge things as they come up. I do agree with you that in terms of leadership, the people that we look at who are the leaders of our society now in governance, most of them have bought this hook, line and sinker. They don't know, a lot of them, they don't know that this has happened. It's all crept in very subtly.
Hello. My question is really, I've come up, excuse me, I've come up against this, what's recommended here, to examine yourself.
Yes.
This concept, I think it goes back to Aristotle or wherever you quoted there.
Yeah.
But my real problem is, what is the template for that? How do you know you have the right template? Because you're already influenced anyway, like, you know. That's my whole thing.
Absolutely. I get this. That's a really, really good question, because, you know, what lens are you looking at yourself through? You know, I would say this is go back to the concept of knowledge and consciousness. The idea that we have a faculty called learning or knowing, that we can follow. We can look, we can take the responsibility for saying, if this is how I'm seeing the world now, what have I looked at that actually contradicts that? What have I explored? How have I educated myself? See, all education is about learning about how the world works and who we are in the world. That's what education is for. That's why it's the most amazing legacy of the Enlightenment. So I do believe that I believe that we have a capacity to have some kind of objectivity about how we are. When we know we have a flawed reasoning, we look for the flaws. That's the self-examination, is to look within, taking the blank plank of our own lives. And this also is part of, when I'm talking about intimacy and connection, the best way to figure out some things about yourself is to ask somebody else.
Okay. But they might be wrongly influenced too.
Well, yeah, exactly. But I mean, if they all agree that you're a bit of an ass, then you probably are, you know.
But they're all taught the same thing.
Yes, right.
The question of ideology
Yeah.
that you mentioned there, and that your book down here, Misled,
Yeah.
is about. And it confuses people, in my view, as to how do we tackle this thing? We don't understand it. Well, here's a small example of how we can see what's right in front of us. An ideology that is embedded in the heads of small children in schools, that will end up with children being mutilated in surgeries by a medical system that is out of control, then we know that that ideology is evil. It doesn't take even a conference of this nature to come to that realization. But this is happening right in front of our eyes right now. And quite recently, the INTO, an organization with which I'm quite familiar, had to withdraw a video that they circulated to their members about how the teacher in the classroom was going to facilitate a conversation with what looked like 5- and 6-year-olds about the transition from girl to boy. We know where that ends up. We know where it ends up. Professor Cass in Britain pointed out where it ends up. It ends up with the mutilation, eventually, of confused children. And when teachers are involved in the spreading of that ideology, then they are part and parcel of the evil.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't know if you have a response, Michael, or else there's a lady in the second row, Adrian, there, just in the second row that wants to contribute.
No, I wasn't going to address that point particularly, but just generally, like, is it not sort of negative to link it to Christianity, particularly like revisioning Christianity, because Christianity is just one of many religions, and a lot, you know, millions of people in the world are not going to identify with Christianity. Like, you could say what was good about religions, possibly, but not linking it to Christianity, because a lot of people have negative,
I do understand.
views of
Yeah,
Christianity.
I get that. I really do get that. But the reason I'm doing that is that because it was Christianity, it was in that. Now, if I was to talk about Islam, for example, that would be a different story, because the historical path, or through Buddhism, through the East, I'm talking about Western civilization, Western culture, it was these aspects of the Christian tradition which offers the richest, to my mind, one of the richest kind of framework. We don't have to tie it. You can have all of these without linking them to Christianity, but that's where the roots are. In other words, you could say, yeah. But we can't do all of that if we take a Buddhist tradition, because it's a completely different system of thinking. Personal responsibility, selfhood, these concepts that have given rise to the Enlightenment were grounded in a Christian understanding of the world. But that Christian understanding of the world was also integrated Roman thinking and the Greek philosophers. So it's not just, but that's where it landed. That's the package that brought us to the Enlightenment.
Thank you, Michael.
Right, okay.
Any other questions, or we wrap up? Just one lady there.
Yeah, okay.
It's probably, I find it difficult to put into words even what my question is. Okay. But it sounds like, it almost sounds like what you're offering is there almost being a conspiracy there to deconstruct like everything in that makes us human.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a bit
No,
broad.
I think that,
you know
yeah,
what I mean?
I think there's a great truth, but I believe that, yeah. I think that's I don't think that is the intention that these philosophers had. They felt that they were doing something really valuable. They thought that they were taking apart a system of knowledge that had led to the Enlightenment and that had led on to other awful things, slavery, colonization, and everything else, and that the thing to do is to dismantle it. But the problem is that when you burn it all down, what are you going to rebuild? What's left? There's no answer to that. You just have all this confusion. You have the person becomes the arbiter of their own truth. There's knowledge is simply, when people are saying, well, I'm not interested, alternative facts. There's a great example of it. Well, I was just using alternative facts. There's no such thing as knowledge. Factuality doesn't mean anything. It's the reduction of consciousness and cognition, there's the three layers of the brain. There's the frog brain, which keeps the frog happy on the lily. The mammalian brain, which is grounded in your feelings and your emotions and your feelings and all the rest of that. And then you have your cerebral cortex, which is your faculty for learning. We're moving back into the mammalian brain, it's how I feel. There's other ways of knowing. This is just a Western way of knowing. We have another way of knowing. What is that? Well, magic. So yes, dismantling these things has huge implications.
But what's the attraction to the dismantling? Why do they want to dismantle? Do you know what I mean?
It's just great fun.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't take a lot of intellectual rigor to do that. It really doesn't. I mean, it's much easier to break something than to build something. And Western civilization is a fantastic opportunity for deconstruction because it's got all these problems. But you throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Sorry. Okay, we'll take two or three more questions. I have two people down at the back that want to speak next, and then I realise there's two people there, Angelina, beside you. So Jerry and Alana, and then we'll go to the front row, and we'll try and move on in the next 6 or 7 minutes to our next speaker. Thank you. So,
I beg your pardon.
Right.
Okay, thank you for a very good lecture. When Jesus was handing the keys of the kingdom to Peter, he told him, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. Now, sheep are very easily led.
Yeah.
So is this an implicit acknowledgement that people were there to be led astray? As I believe the church has managed to do over the last number of couple of hundred years maybe, especially in Ireland.
Okay, the malleability of people is definitely something the philosophers would agree with. I mean, Nietzsche talks about the herd, we're herd animals. And the hardest thing that philosophers talk about is self-actualization. Actually, to become responsible for who you become yourself, to examine your life, to build forward. And there's, for sure, the history of humanity is one of leading people, masses of people, oftentimes into error. That's why I talk about ideology, how ideology captures your mind. If you can capture the mind, you've taken the organ that we have to create who we are. You've taken it, you capture it. And the best time to do that is when you're young. Ignatius Loyola, the Jesuit, famously said, give me your child until he's 7 and I'll show you the man. So, I mean, and, you know, they were only dealt with men back then. Okay.
Do you not think it's possible that some people want to dismantle some of these things because they haven't worked for society for the last couple of while? When you mention stuff like there being this anti-white sort of ideology cropping up, is that not more so like symptomatic of a system that has been racist for decades and that has put so many people at a disadvantage systemically for pretty much all of modern society, as opposed to just wanting to, as you said earlier, kind of cause chaos or make yourself a victim? It can be something productive, I think.
I have no problem with the notion of criticising the flaws in the system, which I think definitely needs to be. If you look at the Enlightenment, for example, you think, okay, one of the things that the Enlightenment finally managed to do was to get rid of slavery.
Yeah, I'm just not sure if the...
So what I'm saying is that when you look and you say, right, dismantling the system and leaving us without any coherent system to replace it with, leaves us wandering in the world. So I haven't seen any solution, to my mind, that comes from simply dismantling these as being a good enough thing to be doing. And I do think that it's easy. That's the other piece. And that's not to take away from the fact that, I mean, one of the things that what I'm talking about in terms of the Enlightenment and when we're talking about Christianity is the notion of human evil. This is something that we do not hear about very much in the world today, is that human beings are the most aggressive creatures that ever inhabited the planet. We need to look at that and say, what does that mean? How do we deal with that? So the other part of that is that, you know, when you think about, none of us are saints. So you ask yourself the question, what's the motivation? For some people, the motivation is very, very subjective and very personal. Insofar as it suits them to do this, it's easy. Write a paper on this or that and everything else. But the overall effect in terms of educating young people to be critical thinkers, to actually really challenge themselves, to think about who they want to become, rather than taking your time to actually criticize everything else. I saw an interview with a student recently, and she said she called it the endarkenment. Shouldn't be called the Enlightenment, should be called the endarkenment. And I'm looking, I'm listening, I feel so sad. I feel sad for this person. And I'm thinking, one day of an untreated toothache for that person, and then give them an offering. You can have the Enlightenment treatment care here, or you can have the shamanic healing over here. Which one are you going to take? You can't dismantle these things without doing terrible damage.
Just going back to possible
Yes.
evil influences on education. I have spent my whole life at this stage in education in Ireland, and I firmly believe that we have a big majority of very well-trained, balanced teachers who are well capable of seeing through any kind of dangerous ideology.
Okay. All right. Yeah. We're here all day. Yes.
Hi. So it was kind of picking up what briefly what
Yes.
that girl said
Yes.
about like that. Maybe would we not think that the dismantling needs to happen? That you know that all that dismantling is now laying something free for young people. Like maybe we should be just supporting them to put it back together again and to find a new way of doing it rather than revising something that didn't work before. There was so much stuff, that didn't work, and the dismantling, in my opinion, was it was needed and was a reaction to the things
I
you
agree.
put up there,
Yeah.
Nazism, communism, all that.
Yeah.
And so now with this dismantling, that there's chaos, this scattered, but through that we can support young people who I kind of think, are doing quite a good job already, probably better than previous generations, and support them to create
Okay.
something new, not
Yeah.
Christianity or not things, something that there is a possibility there to
Sure.
create something different.
The only worry I have about that is that the rates of depression and anxiety and distress and suicide and drug addiction among young people is just rocketing. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, we can maybe agree to disagree on that in terms of the actual, if you look at the research, going back and looking at levels of anxiety on different cohorts, it's doubled between 2012 and 2019. The health service are creaking. The universities are creaking with students not able to cope. So, no, I don't think that it was always like this. I think this particular model of how to be in the world is causing grave difficulty for a lot of people.
It's the age group that I'd be concerned about, that it has gone younger and younger.
Well, social media is part of that too. I mean, there are other factors involved. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the only game in town. This is one piece of the puzzle. There are other hugely important pieces, social media and all the rest of that. So,
Okay, because he has the microphone in hand, this gentleman who actually presented here last year, didn't you? One final comment, and then we have to move on because of time constraints. Thank you.
It's funny where power comes from, out of a microphone sometimes, a microspeaker. Anyway, thank you very much for your presentation and for your patience with the answering the questions. My question really is it possible that in the Western world the cure may be worse than the disease? Now, I'm thinking particularly of the emergence of Christian nationalism in the US under the aided and abetted by, say, particularly the Trump campaign. But is that emergence, because there's a certain kind of leadership, whether you like it or not, emerging there, and that's around this idea of Christian nationalism. Is that cure going to be worse than the disease that we've been talking about here? That's my question.
Yeah, I think it's extremely frightening to think about that, and maybe some of the contributors there are talking about the notion that we look back at Christianity through historically and say what parts of that can we hold on to. With Christian nationalism, we look back and say, okay, they are going back and but they're picking up the bits that actually I would say are toxic, and it's extremely but what happens is, this is what happens when you create the vacuum. This is what happens, as I'm saying to you, when you dismantle everything, and this is going back to what the lady said, when you dismantle everything and you leave a vacuum, human beings don't cope. And what they become is they become attracted to pernicious ideologies which will harness them and bring them. And this is what happened during the Nazi era, in Marxism, in communism. You look at the result of that. Now we've got the mini-narratives, and we've got whole new sets of ideologies at work which fill something for these people to give them a sense of meaning in life. It's terrifying to think about what's going on with Christian nationalism. The worst aspects of it, but this is what will happen. Nature, abhors a vacuum, and psychologically human beings need narrative to help them to give meaning to their lives. And we need to find ones that actually offers people something that will help them to become and live lives that they can flourish in and that they can have a sense of dignity about. What's that ideological position? My argument is some of the legacy of what Christianity offered can do that. Not the whole picture.